gives from your Spirit to his mouth your word. Lord, we ask all of this in the precious name of Jesus, our Redeemer. Amen.
Okay. You guys hear me? All right. Well, good morning. It's a joy to be here right now. I'm excited and I'm humbled to be able to get together with you this morning to dig into God's Word. And if I'm going to be honest, I'm a bit nervous. Nervous not so much from being up here, but just from the subject that I'm going to be talking about. It's suffering. And it's a massive subject. And I so badly want for us to have the joy we've been commanded to have in the midst of our sufferings. And I know that a lot of us are suffering here. As a matter of fact, we all suffer to some degree, some more than others. So if you have your Bibles this morning, I hope you do, I want you guys to turn to 1 Peter chapter 1. And as you guys are turning there, I want to start with a Charles Spurgeon quote. He once shared a story where he met a young sister in Christ just before the service, and as she was coming in, he asked her, he said, "When did you find the Lord?" And she replied, "It was when I was very ill." And he says, "Yes, it is often so. God makes us ill in body that we may have time to think of him and turn to him. What would become of some people if they were always in good health or if they were always prospering? But tribulation is the black dog that goes after the stray sheep and barks them back to the good shepherd. I thank God that there are such things as visitations of correction and of holy discipline to preserve our spirit and bring us to Christ." I love that. And last week, Pastor Ray ended his sermon with the statement, God's sovereignty stabilizes us in our suffering. And I could not have thought of a better way to lead us into this week's subject. And I have to qualify this as, listen, suffering is a subject. It's a subject that's so massive, there is just no way that this sermon can be exhaustive. But the subject is unique in that believers and unbelievers alike have a very common question, which is, why suffering? It's a question both sides have. The difference is that unbelievers tend to use that question to accuse God, whereas believers tend to use that question to cry out to him. And this month we've been focusing in on the sovereignty of God, right? That's been the focus of these sermons, sovereignty of God over our election and now over our sovereignty. And if that means he's sovereign over everything, it means he's sovereign over your suffering. And that truth just opens up a floodgate of questions. And one of the biggest questions is, what does that mean? What does it mean when you say, Buddy, that God is sovereign over my suffering? Does that mean that God is just simply in control while you suffer random things because we live in a fallen, sinful world? That God has overarching plans for man's redemption in Christ, yet he didn't have any specific plans for how suffering would impact our lives once we were reconciled back to him? Is it just a general, purposeless suffering in the midst of a very specific plan of salvation? If that was the case, I couldn't be up here today and give you that message. I don't know how I could encourage you to be joyful in the midst of your suffering with that type of sovereignty. And the good news is that when we read this book, that is not the kind of sovereignty we see. I see a sovereign God that loves us. And his character is the basis of that love. I see a God who chose to suffer for us. And he gave us the perfect example of how we are to suffer. I see a sovereign God that is intricately involved with every aspect of our suffering. That he has purpose in the greatest of our affliction as well as the smallest. And the beautiful part, I love this, the amount of suffering that you endure does not dictate the amount of God's presence you experience during that affliction. God is always fully present in all of our suffering, regardless of the size of it. And I see a God that has chosen to use sufferings as a very specific means for our good and his glory. And that really goes to the question is, how is it for our good? Well, we're going to get there. And Peter is going to help us get there. But this is why it is so important on how you answer the question of how God is sovereign over your suffering. Because how you answer this question reveals how you see God. And how you see God is going to define how you love him and how you worship him. It's going to define how you minister to others in pain. It's going to define how you proclaim the beauties of who Christ is to an unbelieving world. And it's going to define how you yourself endure suffering. And that leads to our theology and why that's so important, because it is what is going to drive our joy in the midst of our suffering. And when I say theology, let's be clear. All it means is how we understand who God is through the study of his word. That's all it means. We hear that word, theology, it's just a fancy word for understanding the nature of God in and through the study of his word. And we see who God is in the heart of the gospel. The gospel of Jesus Christ is the burning heart of our God on display for all to see. And every aspect of our lives as believers flows out of the beauty of that gospel. Every aspect. Our redemption, our restoration, our salvation, our forgiveness, our hope, our ability to endure suffering with joy, our love for the Word of God, the new family we have in the body of Christ, our future hope, and the singular promise that we have one day this broken body will no longer bear the stain of sin, but it will be raised, it will be glorified, and we will finally see the treasures of our heart, Jesus Christ, face to face. All of these things flow out of the gospel, which means the gospel is not a one-time event that we put our faith in and move on. It's the foundation of our faith that we must preach to ourselves daily. The moment we let go of daily finding our joy in the gospel is the moment our living hope begins to dull and blur. I think the reason so many of God's children struggle to have joy in the midst of their suffering is because they're locked their joy onto things other than Christ. And so when those things are stripped away by suffering, so is their joy. Suffering has a way of revealing the idols we have in our life as it strips. So as we jump into 1 Peter, that's what he's going to help us do. He's going to prepare for us the reality that we will suffer, and yet he is going to remind us of the living hope that we have in the midst of our suffering. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and read 1 Peter 1 through 9, and then we're going to go to the Lord in prayer after that. So it starts off, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father and the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ and for sprinkling with his blood. May grace and peace be multiplied to you. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Now, before we get into this, it's important to understand the context of why Peter is writing this letter and who he's writing it to. That sets the stage for understanding what he's saying. And so the audience that Peter is writing to, this has been debated for years, okay? We have scholars who believe that Peter was writing to Jewish believers, and there's a number of scholars that kind of today actually believe that Peter was actually writing to Gentile believers. I think it's fair to say that even if the scholars aren't sure and they can't agree on who he was writing to, Peter knew that both Jewish believers and Gentile believers would be reading his letter. He was aware of that. So if a Jewish believer is reading this letter, they're hearing Peter tell them that God, the God of the Old Testament, the same God their fathers worshiped, is still their God, and that he can still be trusted. And if a Gentile believer is reading this, they're hearing Peter say that the God of the Old Testament, the God they've heard so much from the Jewish nation, he's now their God, and they can trust him. And so as Peter wrote this letter, it was in the midst of chaos in Rome. A fire had pretty much decimated 2/3 of the city, and many believe that Nero, who was the emperor at the time, was the cause of the fire. The Roman people, they were devastated. They felt that their culture had pretty much been destroyed in the fire. And so anger and bitterness really began to rise and grow. And Nero was starting to feel that pressure, and so he realized he needed a scapegoat. And he blamed the fire on the Christians. The result of this was vicious persecution against Christians, and it began to spread throughout the entire Roman Empire. And to be clear, even though Nero blamed Christians, the persecution, it was not state-sanctioned, okay? And it wasn't coming just because Nero blamed them for the fire. This is why it's so important. As you spend time in the Word of God, when we read, we need to understand the audience. We need to understand the hearts of those who are hearing this Word. Peter is writing to people that at this point, they had been Romans and now they're believers, and the culture is hating believers because they are so different. Roman people paid homage and they worshiped Caesar. Well, the Christians, they don't do that anymore. They used to, but they don't do that anymore. And as part of not bowing down to Caesar, there are festivals they can't go to anymore because those festivals included worshiping Caesar. They can't go to the marketplace anymore. They are seen as oddities in the culture. So the original readers of Paul's letter have been blindsided by persecution. There's no way that they could have anticipated the type of alienation and persecution they would be experiencing, not only from the culture, but their family, their friends, their coworkers. And it's painful to them. It's confusing to them. And the persecution and suffering they are experiencing only appears to be getting worse. And Peter is aware of their doubts and their confusion, and he knows they are going to need their best theology for their darkest moments. He knows they are going to need to know how to understand how to suffer and who the God is that is allowing it. And Peter himself, he knows these dark moments. He's experienced the persecution, and he's actually tasted what it means to fail in that persecution. Peter not only denied Jesus, but his eyes locked into the gaze of Jesus in the moment of his failure. I can only imagine that devastated Peter. How wonderful is our God? Because in that moment, even in his failure, you remember what Jesus said? He said, "Satan has demanded to have you that you might sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers." And that's what Peter is doing here. He's strengthening them. He's not writing to them as a disconnected party, unaware of their afflictions, but as one who understands what they are experiencing, and he is shepherding them through this. And hear me, listen, if Peter is shepherding them through their suffering, it means that he is also shepherding us through ours. So the next time you read 1 Peter, remember that and take comfort in it. He is shepherding you. Because if Peter was here today, his words, his exhortation, his encouragement, and how you should suffer would be no different today than it was then. And it's also important to note that although he's writing in the midst of persecution, Peter specifically states in verse 6 that suffering they experience will come in various trials. So Peter is expanding his definition of suffering to go beyond that of only persecution. And this is where we can miss the mark at times. I think at times we think biblical suffering only applies to those who are persecuted for their faith. And by doing so, we end up minimizing and dismissing a massive work the Lord is doing through other aspects of our suffering. We must be reminded that our understanding of suffering, our theology of suffering, expands beyond just persecution. Suffering can come in the form of physical suffering. I say that in the first person we usually think of as Job, right? Job is a perfect example. He was not being persecuted by others for his faith, but he was being tested by Satan himself through incredible physical suffering, through the loss of almost his entire family. And Job actually got the experience where he was able to do the one thing that we want to do. He was actually able to talk to God and ask him why. And what happened? God interrogates Job for a few chapters. Job, he ends up undone. And the one thing Job never got, he never got an explanation. God never told him. Even though we see that God's glory was magnified through Job's suffering, we're encouraged by that. We see that our suffering in the pain and our health and all these different areas can actually have purpose, but Job didn't know that. Suffering can come in the form of also enduring temptations. Jesus has clearly told us that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, and the enemy of our soul is constantly looking to take advantage of that in our lives in order to accuse, discourage, and destroy our peace and our testimony. So Peter, in his care for them, is offering the afflicted believers a theology of suffering. He is looking to help the believers not only endure their current suffering, but also prepare them for the suffering that is to come. And that means that Peter is looking to prepare us as well for suffering. And as Peter begins his letter, his focus is not immediately on their suffering, but he draws their attention and their gaze to God. And I have to stop and say, we've been talking about election, right? Last week, Pastor Ray talked about God electing us. We have this idea that God elects us unto salvation, and it's a privilege. And that's true. There is an election where we are saved and we are restored, and we now have this relationship with God that we didn't have, and that's wonderful, but that is not where it ends. God has elected us unto a mission. We are now the vessels he wants to use to bring that message to a dead and dying world. And Peter is telling us also we have been elected unto suffering. So verse 1 and 2, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ and for sprinkling with his blood. The first thing Peter does, he makes it clear to the readers that they have the attention of the triune God. Peter is not allowing them to think that God is only partially concerned with their situation. No, it's clear that every aspect of God is not only aware, but is present with them. Peter is drawing their eyes above their circumstances. And before Peter addresses anything they're enduring, any of their suffering, he wants to push the believers to cast their eyes to the merciful God, the God that has torn them out of darkness and given them a living hope. In essence, Peter is encouraging them first to see God in the midst of their suffering. Do you see God in the midst of yours? Do you understand that if you are in Christ, you have the attention of the triune God? And if you understand that, how does it affect your heart? Because we can have such a knowledge of truths in Scripture, and yet in the darkest moments, those truths can fail to connect to our hearts. Joy is not going to blossom from a heart that simply knows these truths. Joy will blossom from a heart that in faith believes them and cherishes the reality that God is present in your suffering. And And that's what Peter is doing. He is reminding us of God's presence that our faith may be strengthened. You know, there's another aspect to suffering that Paul addresses in 2 Corinthians 1. Our ability to see God in the midst of our suffering allows for us to help others see God in the midst of theirs. People who have been comforted by Jesus are present with those who are broken and hurting. And God will use those who have suffered and been comforted to now help guide, love, and mediate that same comfort to those who are struggling in their afflictions. God is comforting them through you. The testimony you have is a hope that is alive. That's powerful. Your theology changes the way you endure suffering, and it enables you to step in and comfort those who may even be too young to understand that God is with them, and there is purpose even in their suffering. Peter continues in verse 3. He says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time." Now, the Jewish audience, they would have recognized Peter's blessing here, as his worship is mirroring those blessings that are found in the Old Testament. We've already established the people that Peter is writing to have endured tremendous affliction, and his exhortation was to look up and see God in the midst of their suffering. And next, Peter is now exhorting them to worship God in the midst of their suffering. So Peter, as he's writing to these people, first is saying, see God, worship God, and he hasn't even gotten to their suffering yet. You know, one of the greatest ways I believe that we glorify God is when we are in the darkest moments of our life and we choose to glorify his name and worship him. Get your eyes off of yourself, cast them upwards, and worship the King of Kings. Worship the founder and perfecter of your faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame. Worship the one who has called you into suffering, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you may follow in his steps. Worship the one who bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may be glorified with him. Worship the one who grants us that for the sake of Christ, we should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. That's Paul in Philippians 1:29. Paul, the verbiage Paul uses there, he says, he grants us. It's a privilege to suffer for the name of Christ. I think we can agree that many times that is not the message we hear in American Christianity. That is not the message that's going to fill the seats. We're often told that the stronger your faith is, the more you're going to be blessed, the less suffering you're going to have as your finances increase while you live your best life now. That is not the gospel. That is not the gospel. If we are following a Savior who was unjustly crucified, we should not be surprised when we unjustly suffer as well. As a matter of fact, we should expect it. The parable of the wise man who built his house on the rock was not spared from experiencing the storm. He was able to endure because of what he built his house on. King David, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. King David, not spared, but walking through the valley of the shadow of death, yet praising and worshiping the God that comforts him in the midst of it. These are just examples of what Peter is encouraging his readers and us to do. Worship God in the midst of your trials and afflictions. And finally, we get to verses 6 through 9. He says, "In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him, and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, attaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls." So to pull together, we have verses 1 and 2. Peter is telling us to see God in the midst of our suffering. Verses 3 through 5, Peter is now telling us to worship God in the midst of our suffering. And now these last 4 verses, Peter is exhorting us to trust God in the midst of our suffering. Earlier, Peter tells them that God is going to keep the inheritance for them, that it's untouchable, and it can't be taken away like everything else in this life. And he's not only keeping the inheritance, he's keeping them, which means he's keeping you. If you belong to Christ, that is the promise. He's keeping you. And in verses 6 through 9, Peter explains how God is choosing to do this. "In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." Peter is encouraging the believers that the very tests and trials which God is using is producing a suffering, and that is the very instrument in which God is using to refine the genuineness of their faith. And there it is. First, suffering is revealing the genuineness of your faith. Now, I think of the parable of the sower and the seed. We know that the seed fell on many different soils. Some received it with joy, but the cares of this world, the pleasures of the world drowned it out. There was only one soil that was good, that produced fruit. Suffering will eventually reveal if Christ is the treasure of our hearts. And second, suffering is refining your faith to grow your perseverance and endurance as a testimony that the work of God lasts. God was and still is testing you in his furnace of affliction so that his glory can be put on display through your yielded life. You know, the last 3 verses Peter writes, I find still astounds me to this day. He says, "Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls." What kind of work has God done in the hearts of those he has redeemed to instill in us a love for Jesus that eclipses everything else in the world? A faith he's created that can endure the darkest of sufferings, and a joy so great that, according to Peter, is inexpressibly filled with glory. How great is that work when we have never even physically seen, touched, met, or spoken to Jesus? Yet those who belong to Christ have met him. We have heard his voice. We have heard his call, and we actively speak to him. That is the paradox of what God sovereignly does when he redeems someone. It's just as amazing to me. We've never met or seen him, yet he is the treasure of our lives. Is that something we do? That is a work God sovereignly does in our hearts. Praise God for that. Not all men have faith. But where genuine faith is found, so is the token of divine favor, as Spurgeon would say. And if you possess this faith, then assuredly know your faith will be tested. The very nature of faith implies a degree of trial. In Luke 21, Jesus says, "You will be hated by all for my name's sake, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your lives." God promises that he's going to keep us. What a promise. You know, I've heard John MacArthur say this. He says, if I could lose my salvation, I would. And I believe that. God does a work in He redeeming us, and He does a work that keeps us. But there's also a call that we have to endure. He promises He's going to keep us. He is sovereignly crafting the very endurance we need to ensure we faithfully finish the race set before us. We just really struggle with the instrument that God uses to create endurance, and that's suffering. We don't like it. The flesh hates it, and I get it. I'm with you. We crave comfort, and the Lord knows that. Listen, I know many of us at Bethel are struggling. I know there are many here that are suffering deeply. There are a number of people in this congregation that are experiencing deep, serious health issues. Do not forget that God is with you in the fire. He has promised that. I know, trust me, I know, in those darkest moments, we can hear that whisper that says, God is not with you. I think every single one of us at times in our life have heard that. And in that moment, we're going to be tempted to believe that's true. We're going to be tempted to believe that there really is no purpose in our suffering, that God is not with us. And you need to remember this, and this is so crucial. Your faith is not your feelings. Your faith overcomes your feelings. It speaks to your mind and your soul that is not true, that is the lie of the enemy, that you have been redeemed, you have been restored, you have been reconciled to a God that loves you. And there is purpose, especially when you don't feel it. Your faith is what enables you to trust God's heart revealed in His word when you cannot trace His hand. I want to finish with, many of you guys know Sherry Esplin and John Esplin. John recently passed. And Sherry, she shared with me that the last 10 days of John's life were very difficult. As a matter of fact, the last 10 days of his life, he didn't have any food or water, yet his body continued to endure. And I know that Sherry was struggling. She's looking at this and she sees her husband and she says, Father, why? Why? My husband is suffering. What's the purpose? And she's feeling the same thing any of us would be feeling in that moment. Why is he staying here? He can't eat, he can't drink, he can't speak. There is nothing. And yet with every painful, labored, yet sovereignly appointed breath, gospel conversations were happening in the next room. People were coming to say goodbye to John. And they were hearing about his love for Jesus. They were hearing about the gospel. They were hearing about a man named Jesus who John loved, who he served, who redeemed him, who gave him hope. They were hearing about the Jesus that they need as well. We don't know the number of people that may come to glory because God used John without lifting a finger, without doing a single thing, simply with every appointed breath God gave him, he was being used for his glory. Remember that. Remember that. In the darkest of your moments, preach the gospel to yourselves. God loves you. There is an enemy that is looking to kill and destroy that peace and that belief that God is with you in the suffering. And I'm going to end with this. Paul says in Romans 8:18, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." Listen, I think Paul probably suffered more than all of us combined. And yet he can say here that the sufferings that we experience in this time are not even worth comparing. They're a shadow of the glory that we have to come. I hope you're encouraged by that. What we experience is light and momentary. It will pass. What we inherit is eternal. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we recognize that you have chosen to use suffering as a means. You've given us the greatest example that we have in Christ of one who unjustly endured suffering. And he did it for the joy that was set before him. He did it as an example to us of how we are to suffer. Father, I praise you. And so thankful that you have done a work in each and every one of our lives of those of us who belong to Jesus, to help us see that suffering is something that not only we should expect, that we should see that it has been granted as